and welcome back to Sidelines, and welcome back to Coaches Roundtable. Today's topic will be conflict resolution and dealing with conflict. Joining me on this panel is the field hockey head coach, Brittany Hansrote, the women's basketball head coach, Michael Whitling, and the cross-country track and field men's and women's head coach, Mike Rohl. Thank you all so much for stopping by.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's talk about it. We discussed it last week a little bit with the group I had. We got into dealing with conflict and the inevitability that there will be internal team conflict on your team. When there is that, first of all, what are the signs that you can tell that there might be something going on between some of these teammates?
For me, like I can tell in practices if there's tension and if people are avoiding each other. I'm very intuitive and I pick up on things easily with body language and just behavior. So I can always tell there, and especially if they're like going one-on-one and you can sense a tension, I'm like, something seems to be up there. So oftentimes when we've had conflict, that's kind of been the starting point that I've noticed, or kids sometimes come to me as well.
I would agree with that Britt's absolutely right. You can start to see it in their attitudes towards each other. My experience is they start having some snarky comments back and forth, and then you can kind of tell there's some conflict there. I've had some teams in the past though that have held their snarky comments until afterwards, or in locker rooms, or out of off the court. What do you guys deal with that a little bit, or how do you guys deal with that when that comes about?
Well, for me, there's a little bit of a difference. I'm dealing with both genders, and like what Mike and Britt said about seeing the body language in conflict, I see that with the women teams much more. The men are much more open and direct. They don't tend to go into the snarky comments and the off. They seem to resolve it right there and then. And so that's just a different observation of coaching the two genders.
But going back to the good question that Coach Witt brought up, was when you see this, what are the steps you try to take to deal with that conflict?
I usually, my captain or captains, depending on the time of year and how many we have, are usually pretty good about trying to manage little things that are minute, things that are just little off the field, things that are just not even field hockey related. And it could be a various list of things that we won't get into, but so I really try and have them learn through those experiences and times and difficulties, because the big thing I say to my girls always in a lot of different scenarios is that this is preparing you for life after college, and you're going to deal with conflicts, whether it be with professors or beyond college in grad school, or roommate situations, getting into the workforce, into your professional job. You're going to deal with conflicts with either coworkers, bosses, you name it. And how are you going to deal with that adversity, and how are you going to manage that? So really, if they go through experiences of working through conflicts, it can prepare them better for their professional life. But if things are really a big deal, and we've had those in the past, like you say, every team goes through these, then yeah, absolutely. We've done, it varies on what it is. We've done different things. We've done me sitting in the room and kind of mediating between both parties. We've had captains in with me. There's been times where the captains can be mediators and deal with it. But again, it really depends on like what is the conflict and can they work through it. And sometimes even with us now coaches in the professional world, I've dealt with conflicts that I can deal with myself, or I look to somebody to help me. So it really depends on what is actually going on and what the conflict is.
Yeah, attacking it head on, I think is definitely the appropriate thing to do. And I think, in this day and age, we don't always like to have the tough conversations, me included. And I think, getting our student athletes to get in those tough conversations more and more will only help them in the future. And that's something that I haven't done a great job of in the last couple of years is hitting those head on. But I think it's vital for those leaders of your team to have those tough conversations, even though they might not be popular. It's what needs to be done to get the job done at the end of the day.
I agree. Taking some of these issues on directly is usually the best way to do it, especially if it's going to escalate to something that's going to, if they start to divide in half. But one of the things that I've always tried to remember, growing up, my great grandfather was about 90 years old. And my father and his three brothers all had three or four children each. And we would have family gatherings, and invariably something would happen between cousins, right? There would be some squabble. And I can remember I was about 13 or 14 at the time, and some squabble had occurred between my cousins. They were younger, and my Uncle Bill was mad at my dad. My dad was mad at my Uncle Bill. And at that point, their father had passed away, but Pa was still alive. And I can remember him bringing them together. He's this old man with his pants up above his belly and completely bald, and just brought them both together and said, look, you two need to not fight over what these kids are doing, because you'll all remember that you're mad at each other, 2 weeks from now. Those kids that were just in that fight that just, threw rocks at each other are friends again. Go look at them. And sure enough, the kids were already back and playing. And so what I always try to think about with conflict resolution is this something that's going to escalate, or is it something that they're going to be fine with? Because once I intervene as a coach, I now become the heavy. And so I'm very particular about when I'm going to step in, because a lot of times those things will just resolve themselves in a few days. So old wisdom there from Pa.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that's where it stems to me saying, like, when I get involved or not, it's very, very, very true, because you also don't, the old saying, we'll bring one up, you don't want to create a mountain out of a molehill either. So you don't want to draw more attention than is needed to something that might easily fade out or die out. So yeah, and I think this is funny to what Whit was saying, confrontation, like that is, this generation, the younger generation, that is something that is so hard for them, because they grew up with technology and it's so easy to be on a phone or a computer or what have you, and not have to deal with as many confrontations, or whether they're good or bad, in person. So that's where it's really important, at least for me, my philosophy is really trying to get them to understand that you do have to deal with people. You do have to be able to communicate, carry yourself properly, use your words properly, because that's going to set you up for success and put you ahead of others who aren't prepared. And I think it also circles back to the roundtable that you guys already had, where Seth and Schaefer, John Schaefer, and Gonk were on. They were talking about culture, like your team culture a lot of times can and will carry you through and easily get you over little conflicts that may arise if your culture is really sound. And then also your leadership. So I know that was another topic discussion, talking about leadership. Well, if you have the right leaderships, whether they're captain title or not, and people who have the best interest of the program at heart and at the forefront of things, then that can easily solve things as well, or de-escalate situations that might have escalated otherwise if you didn't have strong leadership or a really good culture in place. So they really all tie together. So I agree, Drew, it's perfect we're talking about this, because they all really intertwine heavily.
It's it's interesting that you bring that up, especially the culture aspect. And last week last week, by the time people are watching this one, will be the identifying student leaders group, and so going on to that, and that's actually what got us onto this topic. And since you guys weren't on that group, I can ask you, those student leaders, how important is it to identify a student leader? It doesn't have to be a captain, but a student leader who is able to deal with conflict if that comes up.
I mean, it's everything. As far as I'm concerned, it's everything to have that leadership inside the team that's bought in, that is trying to do things the right way. It's everything as far as I'm concerned. It's that person that's going to have the tough conversations. The person that's going to say, "Hey, knock this stuff off. We need to get focused and go right back at it." To me, that's everything. That's what builds your culture.
Yeah, just kind of adding into that, establishing the leadership that matches the culture that you're trying to establish is really important. We, for the track and field program for the last 2 years, I've really been emphasizing a culture that's a little different than your typical athletics-minded culture. We talk about two things: kindness and empathy. And that's not something that you hear prioritized in a lot of athletics. You hear about discipline, integrity, and hard work and all these things. But we talk about these two aspects of it. And what I found is that when I can get the kids who are 100% committed into the program, loyal to the program, want to do the things, if I can get them to express those values in a kind and empathetic way to people who aren't necessarily bought in, but could be, if I can get them to present it in a way that's like that, then I find that they can bring more people in. And so that's one of the things that we work with the more vocal kids that are more leadership oriented is, can we do this in a kind manner? Can you do this in an empathetic manner so that you can bring people in rather than alienate them? And I know some people have asked me in the past, why do you emphasize kindness so much? And I tell them, because, when you're outside in January and it's 15 degrees and you're doing a workout and it's really, really hard and everybody's cold and everybody's miserable, nobody wants to do that with a jerk. So you've got to be nice to people. So it helps to be out there with a good attitude and being empathetic and being in that foxhole together.
Yeah, I think the other piece that I would add is just that identifying a strong leader is somebody who is, tying into what the other two said here, like completely bought in. Their priorities, their work ethic, everything aligns with what you're looking for in a leader, because then that becomes contagious. Is if you get more people to join onto that, it becomes more contagious. And the same goes to the other side. If there's negativity, that can be contagious as well. So you really need to get the right people on board and bought in and have the right leaders in place to hold accountable themselves, but then also their teammates. The biggest thing is that those leaders are your eyes. They're your eyes when you have, for my sake, I have 20 some kids and I can't watch 20 some kids every single movement. So they can be out on that field and holding each other accountable like a side conversation. I'll use that as an example. Like somebody just gets caught up in a side conversation as we're preparing for a drill or prepping, or I'm going through something. It gets easy to get distracted if another team's on the field practicing. And that's where I really rely on, and I'll say too, I don't have a full-time assistant. So like I do have assistants, but they're, whether they're not always there, like I really, really do rely on my captains to be that middle person, and be like my right-hand woman, to really be eyes and hold accountable. And then off the field, like I'm not there. I'm not at their homes. I'm not there every day of the week, or when they're going to class, like I don't follow them around, or if they're going out or over to a friend's house, wherever they're going, and out representing Mansfield University. So they are going to see those things probably daily versus me not seeing off the field stuff as much. So that's crucial too, because you want to make sure you're representing the program and athletics and Mansfield University in the highest standards.
You know, I think it's a point there too that you specifically have been a student athlete here at Mansfield, so I'm sure that has helped try to have that relation. But I mean, I guess elephant in the room of the other two coaches we have here is you guys coach a women's sport. So is there a little bit of a divide there, or how do you go around that when, you know what, Coach Witt coaching a women's team, if there's conflict on them that they might want to speak to a female, or Coach Rohl on the women's side of things, if there's something going on there that they don't feel comfortable speaking to you guys, how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, I think it's very important for, you know, I'm fortunate enough to have an assistant, and you know, I think she has been such a huge help in that department. You know, it just, for them to be able to go to her with anything. And I think somebody mentioned about being the heavy, right? Well, players don't always want to go to the heavy right away, right? Because it may not be an issue. It may just be a small issue that they want to handle, but they don't want the heavy to know about it, right? And they can handle it on themselves, and I think they want that responsibility. So, but I think it's crucial for me coaching a women's sport to have another female assistant there to be able to, you know, help them through some situations.
Yeah, I'm fortunate that I have Michelle helping me primarily with the women's teams. I've had to coach the women pretty solely for many years as well. I think there's a little bit of a difference in culture between sports. I can assure you that in my years of coaching the women, women runners anyways, are very rarely afraid to share anything with me, much to my dismay at times. So it's just the way it is with runners. But I think it becomes the nature of the conflict. You know, I think back to different groups that I've had. I get groups of really good kids who don't like each other, and I can't for the life of me figure out why they don't, because they come from shared backgrounds and they have same family values, and but they won't get along. And particularly, I think back to some of the women's teams that I had around 2008 to 2012, that 4 or 5 years. I had some kids that had values that were exactly the same. You know, a couple of examples I can think of. They're both large Catholic families, running families, and yet I could not get them to run together. And they wouldn't, no matter what I said. And they were both, you know, A students, didn't drink, just not, there was no resolution to that conflict. To this day, I still don't know what it was, but we just had separate practices, so that's the way that went.
It's interesting. The other big thing and an important thing that tends to get brought up in this is if someone confides in one of you guys, the idea of privacy, of where that line is to keep it internal, or if it's something serious to go to the AD or someone, or a teacher or something like that. Where is that line for you guys when you're dealing with a student? If something gets to a point where you're going to have to report it to a higher up? Or is there a specific line?
I mean, we have pretty strict guidelines right now as to what we're supposed to do in terms of mandated reporting, in terms of sexual assaults and other type activities. we're all pretty versed in that and know when we have to do that. Um, I don't think I've ever had a point where I've had to have two athletes come in and meet with the athletic director because we couldn't resolve the conflict within the team. So I can't imagine what that would be like. I wouldn't want to do that.
I mean, I'll speak that we have, I mean, us as coaches have to go through training every year as far as sexual violence and assault and mandated reporting. So yeah, I agree. We know what to look for, and if things do occur, we have to then report. So we do know that chain of command. And then, yeah, as far as the other things go, you sort of have to like you're saying, Drew, sharing information, like, as long as you have set boundaries. I mean, kids are kids. We're all human, so sometimes things slip out, or you don't know people are around, and you say things. Like, I guess just I take it case by case is kind of how I deal with it, and I try to do my best to my professional duties to keep a separation professionally, but then also if I hear things, deciphering them as I go. How do I handle this case by case?
I mean, obviously there becomes a line too that you never want to think about, but if someone, and it doesn't have to be related to violence or sexual violence or that, but there's a line where someone you realize is not going to fit with this team. There's too much conflict. Where is that line that, unfortunately, if someone crosses, you have to have that discussion? And how do you have that discussion with an athlete to say, you have to step away from this team?
That's always a hard discussion to have, but it's a line where I think when it starts to hurt the team as a unit, then it's a line that we generally can't go back from. You know, if it's isolated and it's not affecting the team as a whole, I think we're still good. But when it starts affecting the team as a whole, or it starts affecting culture, or things of that nature, then I think it's a discussion that has to be had, and right away. The longer it goes, the worse off it gets. In terms of the discussion, I think the discussion just, hopefully you've had discussions with the student athlete before this, but you just reiterate, what the issues are, and keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, following up on that, that is a hard thing. So when do you do that? When I begin to spend more time on that individual than I do on more than 3 other people, where it becomes such a distraction that it's affecting day-to-day practice. It's affecting work in the office. We as in athletics, we get to work with really great kids. Good leaders, strong students, nice people all around. And we get blinded, because we'll go 2-3 years with kids like that. And all of a sudden we'll recruit a kid that we think is going to fit in and they're going to do all the things right. And then they get there and you find out that, like many things in the world, that they're just not a nice person and they're causing you all kinds of trouble. So one of the things that I do before that is I let everybody know right from the very first day that everybody's on the team because I brought them there, and anybody can be off the team because I don't want them there. And that can be a little harsh. I say it in as nice a way as I can. But that kind of sets it up for, and then going back to being kind and empathetic, if you're not those things, I've warned them many times beforehand to not be like that. And so yeah, it's the inverse BS rule, basically. How much BS are you going to put up with from a kid is inversely related to what they contribute to the team.
And look, and I know it's something that you never want to have to do, to let someone go from a team. But again, there are sometimes these things that Coach Witt, you were saying, affect the team or distract from the day to day, and you got to gauge that. I like that answer. So
think about Colin Kaepernick, right? I use him as an example of, that was a good dude, a pretty decent football player, and nobody would take him. And I would say that a good majority of the reason why was because he was going to be a media distraction. And so, NFL teams were weighing the same things about, should I take that distraction? Should I not take that distraction? So I don't mean to go all controversial or nothing, but
no, but that's a good point. Like that line, trying to find that line of if they're going to still help and they're too much of a distraction. Is that a solid set line, or is that kind of hazy and it just depends on case by case?
Definitely hazy, I think. It's definitely case by case.
Even if you've got a really good athlete and they're negatively affecting the training session because they're being distracting, or they're making other athletes uncomfortable because they've had a fight. One of the things that I'll do to avoid having a conflict in practice, if somebody's out of line too much, I just tell them they have to leave. They have to leave practice. And it's different, for Mike and for Britt. Their teams have to work together and be in positions and all that. My kids are running around the track, and their times are their times. So if I send a kid out for practice because they're not getting along with people, that makes the practice better for them. Like, it doesn't affect them negatively. It makes it better for everybody else. So
that's actually kind of a really good point too, because for certain events in track and field, and even for cross country, you're pretty much running solo with the group. So the differences between the true team sport aspect and I don't want to say individualized sport, because there's obviously team aspects to it, but where you can focus more on the individual side in track and field. The differences there between inter-team conflict and the effect that it has on the team. Do you find, Coach Rohl, that it's less of a big impact if there's a team conflict than, say, a regular team sport where you have everyone on the field at the same time trying to do the same thing?
Oh, it can absolutely destroy a track team when you have individuals that don't get along, especially if they're in different event groups. We may be out there running on our own, but if you've got 30 or 40 kids cheering for a teammate on the sideline, they know it and they feel it. Mm-hmm. And when somebody goes out there and runs really well and nobody cheers for them, or the case that I'm thinking about where maybe one group has said, oh, we're not going to cheer for that person, and that person comes back and they're not being told, oh, good job, nice race, because their teammates are ignoring them because they're being jerks. That can be absolutely devastating to a kid, and they can walk away from the team. You could lose a really nice kid because of just flat out rude bullying behavior, which can happen in a track and field team. So it makes a 12-hour track meet really uncomfortable when you got kids fighting with each other.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the other two, Britt and Coach Witt, you guys could say how, like, there's just one cog that isn't working and how it can affect the unit that is on the field and the court for you guys.
Yeah, for sure. It's can be very detrimental, especially when they're not on the same page. That's, yeah.
So we've talked about the inner athlete conflict, but sometimes inevitably there will be conflict between you guys and a student, or they're giving you back talk, or they're not listening to a thing you're trying to say. It happens. So what are your approaches to that aspect? If there's a conflict between a player and you, how do you try to right that situation?
I think it's the same thing. I think you got to sit them down and have discussion with them, and maybe reestablish some expectations of what their role is, how they are to handle themselves, things like that. I think that's really all that needs to happen.
I can think of a couple of conflicts that I've had over time. I had one female athlete come in very upset with some things that had happened with other athletes. They were misbehaving. She didn't like the way I handled it. Expressed herself rather loudly and with a fair amount of profanity. And I just listened and let her yell and be mad. And but then in that particular case, I took into consideration what that person was saying and said, okay, you know what? You've got a couple good points here. We're not going to deal with that situation like that anymore. This is how we're going to deal with it next time. She didn't disagree in that particular case that the people that I was on were wrong. She just didn't like the way I did it. And so that taught me, and that was pretty late in my career. So that taught me to listen more to the athletes first, decide whether they're just venting or whether it's something I can do something about. So, and then I've had other people just come in and, they don't like anything I do. So I tell them, well, that's too bad. So you're 18, you don't know as much about running as I do, and we're not doing it that way. So.
And I can talk about, here's a good topic to talk about is when conflict happens in the heat of a moment. So in a game or in the middle of a practice and a drill, practice that you can stop and pause what's going on, obviously. But in a game, you can't until, for our sport, there's a time, well, we don't have timeouts, our breaks, periods, halftime. Or if they sub off the field. So subbing is a good example of something I'll do if there's a conflict where they're not understanding what I'm saying, or maybe they're in disagreement with what I'm saying. I don't often have that, but every once in a while I will with a more seasoned player where what they're seeing and thinking is different than mine. But if there's something we can't resolve during the game around the field, like quickly, then I will sometimes sub them off because I want to hear what they're seeing and saying if both of us aren't aligning, because I want to get us on the same page first and foremost. But like, I want to make sure I'm not missing something, because what they see on the field is completely different at times than what I might be seeing, and then vice versa. Like, I might see something that they don't need to hear about, and then it's also good to get feedback from them. Like, well, this is what I'm feeling and seeing on the field. So then, like, I look at it as a collaboration. Now, when it's conflict, that's like maybe there is no getting them on the same page or talking to them because they're so heated. Or, I get heated up in a moment with what's going on, and it's consistently I'm saying, I don't know, pull right on this person instead of going left. They keep going left, and then there's attitude. How do you resolve that? Because you're in the middle of a game. But that's how I do. Like, I'll sub them, or if we have a break, like, be like, all right, let's hit the restart button, get back out there, we'll talk about it. And then I usually follow up with that player after the game, just to make sure we're all always on the same page. And then emotions have settled down, and then we can sort of talk about it more. I think that's really important, because then otherwise it's very common for my players to maybe hang on to that and wonder, oh, is coach mad at me, or I'm still really upset as a player, maybe, so it's easy. You want to just try and put that to the wayside. Let's move on. And my big saying is move on to the next play. And that means literally what it means, but also like a lot of more general statements, just in general, like just move on. If something needs to be talked about, we will. If not, move on. Like you're going to make mistakes. It happens. So that's that one. And then in practices, like I've had a few cases where I've had some conflicts with players, like they're not pushing hard and they're giving feedback and it's negative. Then if it deems me, saying something to them right in practice because they're not, adhering to what the rules and standards are, then they will hear it from me, and the other players see that. And I think it's important for other players to see that you have a standard for yourself as a coach and that you are going to hold people accountable when they're being disrespectful. Because if you don't hold it accountable, then your other players will be like, oh, she did nothing about that, so now I can do that. Or they don't take you as serious. So you really have to find a fine line of setting a standard and making sure that you follow that standard as a coach. But you don't want to be inappropriate either. So it's, for me, I just feel like I'm always case by case trying to find a balance and trying to be consistent as a person, as a human being, and as a coach. And it's not easy because we're human. You just do the best you can.
Well said.
Sorry, that was long-winded. But
No, that was great. But to that point, though, in the middle of a game, in the middle of an event, there will inevitably be something, and I think it's interesting because of the rule change in field hockey about taking the timeouts away, and you not having that aspect of it. Cross country and track, there's not a timeout. I mean, you have in between events for track, but if there's conflict in the middle of a race in cross country, there's really not much you can do about that. Basketball, you might have the easiest time trying to settle things, but for you, Coach Whit, in the middle of a game, if there's an argument, if there's someone who didn't do an assignment and a basket got put in, what are you doing to kind of calm down that conflict at a timeout or at a half, or what do you do in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think in a timeout, there are times to get on them about it, and there are times to let the emotions come down and then talk with them, usually in a rational manner. We do have a lot more timeouts. We do have a lot more timeouts in our game, which can help. The substituting, I think, is a little bit more basketball, and I think there one of the things that I like to do when I think it's going to be heated is when they come off to go high five down the bench and then come sit down by one of the assistant coaches, and usually one of the assistants will kind of calm them down a little bit, and then I'll usually come in after a minute or so and then talk to them. And usually emotions have ratcheted down after that. It's the same thing. It's the same thing in the end of the game because basketball is a very emotional sport, much like field hockey is. There's got to be that cool down period, and I try to emphasize to our team not to text, tweet, FaceTime, whatever, social media for about 20 minutes afterwards, because there is that emotional time that they need to come down from the game. So so we don't really have, we'll have a post-game talk, but after that there isn't much conversation for about 20 minutes afterwards. So that's kind of how I handle things.
Yeah, I would follow up on that. Drew, you've seen me at track meets with the kids. When they have outstanding performance, we have these huge bursts of emotion and elation. But then almost immediately everyone separates and just kind of gathers themselves up. And then we have debriefings afterwards in between the events where we talk about what went wrong. The way I coach with the distance runners and the sprinters, we talk about race models and strategies in the race all the time. And that can that can create a conflict between a coach and an athlete in terms of how I want those races run or what I'm trying to do. The first thing is that I try to be as clear up front with what the plan is and why we want to follow that plan. But I still get kids, who will want to do things like run really hard from the front, and won't follow the race plan, won't lay back. And essentially, we just have to let them make mistakes. And then it's never good to tell them that they screwed it up right afterwards. So we let that sit. Sometimes I don't even talk to them about the race until we're on the bus ride home, because I want to make sure that I'm as composed as possible, that I have all the splits, that I have all the details of the race, that I've gone back over it, and what I've observed is correct. Because there's been too many times where, immediately after a race, I'm not saying that I've ever said this, but I've heard coaches say it, and I've said things like it where like, well, that was just trash, and you have that impulse response, and that's just never a good thing. So.
And I know, like, even to the opposite side of that, sometimes when you have a bad race and trying to keep them motivated and dealing with that conflict, because that's negativity, or a bad game or a bad play, that there's that negativity that can creep in, and in the game, you don't want that to turn into something, or in the event, you do not want that to turn into something. So how do you approach that? If someone is so hard on themselves because of something that just happened, how do you try to right that mindset?
Well, that was me as a player, so I can relate to that very well. I was really hard on myself as a player, and it took myself to get myself over it. Like, nobody could do anything or say anything. You could talk me up as much as you wanted, but like, that's a personal hurdle you need to get over yourself as a player, to find, like, mine wasn't a lack of confidence. Like, I just knew when I made a mistake, and I would be self-detrimental that I couldn't get over it. Like, it would affect me in the next play. Hence why one of my biggest statements is move on to the next play. But so I can really relate very well with my athletes in particular when they do have that struggle. And I tell them, look, you got to work through this yourself. Positive encouragement. I think it helps them to hear, like, oh, coach went through this too. So I find myself trying to relate to them in ways with that, and just other things, if I can relate to them and let them know, like, hey, look, your own coach, she's vulnerable. Like, this has happened to everybody. Like, not maybe that example, but other things. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like my approach to try and go that route.
I agree with that, and I also have, I think we have a bunch, at least in women's basketball, we seem to have a bunch of perfectionists or want to be perfectionists, and I am self-admittedly try to be one myself, and that's not really a healthy way to do it. And so most recently I have used, like, in practice have said something along the lines of, hey, do it this way. It's okay if it's okay if you mess up on it. It's okay. And I think that one comment has like just been very, very good for our team. It's also just opened them up to, okay, coach thinks it's okay if I make a mistake. It's okay. Nothing bad's gonna happen here. And I think it's relaxed them a little bit.
Players. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say that is probably one of the more difficult things that I've had to deal with, is the conflict between when I think they've done okay and they think they've done horrible. And I have all the objective evidence to say, yeah, that's all right. That's your second fastest time, or this is what you did well. And boy, I'll tell you what, that just, I all the time, just like Mike said, just let them know that they can make a mistake and it's not the end of the world, because sometimes they just act like it is. And I'm just thinking to myself, you ran a you ran 1 second off your best time. What are you worried about? Man, they go nuts. Just let them calm down. Let them work through it like Britt did.
Hey, it worked out for my case, but I had a play past year, and she was, like I said, that example. She had that problem, that struggle, I should say, not a problem, struggle. And there were a lot of times where on the bus rides home, and even in my office afterwards of that player, I was fortunate that she felt comfortable, and maybe it was because I said, like, hey, like, I went through this too. Like, I know how you're feeling. I know all the thoughts and emotions. Like, it was therapeutic for her to then talk to me about it, and just get it off on how she was feeling, and recap those moments. Like, it's all about figuring out the player that you're coaching from each player to player, and then navigating that path with them. Like, this particular player, she thrived, and it felt so much better to talk about it, to rehash, to go back, watch film, to say, okay, let me get closure on that. That's maybe the term to use. Like, that person needed closure, and then to talk about it, and then moving forward, what could we do better moving forward? Okay. So we would do that a lot of times with that. I would do that with that player, and that ended up helping her so much, that she felt so much more better on the field. And then I think in turn that maybe helped her get herself over that hump a lot. By her senior year, she ended up having her best year to date, was because I think her mentality was a lot more different, and more of a clear mind, and more of that closure, and like knowing personally how to manage that within herself, pre-game, during game, post-game, and with practices, and that she knew she could always come and talk to me about it, and that I was going to listen, and we were going to talk through it.
There's one more thing before we get to the parting shots, because I have the three of you, and I think all of you guys have been in a unique situation because you all have had multi-sport athletes on your teams, and dealing with that student who might have a time conflict,